Hello, everybody. Today we have a great pleasure to being joined by Professor Chris McCabe, who is a professor of molecular endocrinology at the University of Birmingham and also the director of research, working on mechanisms of endocrine cancer. He has lectured widely, both with science and also as a writer with specific interest in communication of science. So, Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for the amazing career interview for the EYES Committee. We will begin at the beginning, and that is, how did your journey in science start, and how did it lead you to your current field of research, and just an overall start of the story?
I was interested in science relatively earlier, but I was also interested in literature. So, this is something we may come back to. In my life, I ended up being a writer of fiction as well as a scientist. And I think in the education system, of course, at some point you have to choose, am I a scientist or am I an artist or whatever? I chose science at that time. And I was really interested in genetics. And really, I guess my journey into what I do today was that in my PhD in genetics, which involved fruit flies, I was really interested in behavioral genetics, and then got interested in how hormones might turn genes on and off. And so I guess it was all about how genetics and hormones interact to change various facets of how organisms and humans act. And then I guess the third evolution there really was how that then gets dysregulated in cancer. And I think that really, has taken me to where I am today.
All right. And can you tell us about your first publication ever?
Yeah, well, I can. Yes. It was called Oviposition in Drosophila melanogaster. And I'm not sure anyone in the world has ever read it, but I spent my PhD looking at how the fruit fly laid eggs in relation to single base pair genetic mutations in the fruit fly. And it was, again, coming back to this issue that kind of blew my mind at the time, that a single nucleotide change in the Drosophila, 300 million base pair genome, could change such a critical evolutionary behavior as the ability and the timing of laying eggs. So that was what my first publication was on. It was difficult because I didn't publish it during my PhD. It was only when I started my first postdoc in a completely different field that I went back and I wrote the paper myself and published it myself, because I was aware that it was critical to have a publication for your PhD.
So you have written this paper, and it was a start of, I guess, the expansion of the universe of science in a way. But one very interesting thing that you mentioned is the process of choosing between a career in science and a career in art. We know that a lot of doctors through history had a very wide interest in human sciences and human interactions in many ways. And I feel that this is something that probably a lot of other medical professionals encounter in some moments. This needs to explore the human. And how did you end up choosing and reconciling your interests now in later career that you have, like between their interest in art and writing, and also how do you mix arts with medicine in a way that it's both efficient, but they both stay in their own lane in a way?
Yeah, a few interesting points there. I mean, I became a postdoc, and then after probably about 5 years of postdocing, I decided that I'd always thought I could write a novel, and that's not an arrogant thought. It was just something I felt inherently I would be able to do, and so I did it, and I got my first book published, and it sold very well in the UK and Europe. and that was great. I had to change my name, so I never wrote novels under my science name because I mean, the obvious criticism of a scientist who writes fiction is, well, is your science also fiction? So I tried to demarcate them by writing under different names. And then I went on to publish 9 novels in total. Some of them were very successful, some weren't. You know, I always tried to keep that discipline separate, but the only time they really overlapped, my second novel, which is terrible, was really my attempt to write fiction seen through the eyes of a laboratory scientist. And I don't think it's a very successful experiment. It's probably the worst book I've written of the 9. And then, you know, for my later books, I actually used some of the science and wrote forensic thrillers, and used what we were doing in the lab every day, you know, and saying, well, what if you had a rogue scientist who became, you know, who started to manipulate forensics? What if you took forensic science and rather than just use it to catalog what has happened in the past, what if you could use it to anticipate what might be happening in the future, etc. So I think, you know, they have been a slight overlapping of boundaries at times, but it was terrific to keep those things separate. And I'd really, really enjoy writing fiction if I'd been writing scientific prose, because scientific prose is very difficult and very structured, whereas fiction is just, it can be anything. Real freedom. I want to point out that I have stopped writing, though. I haven't written a book for probably 7 or 8 years at the moment. It's something I may well go back to.
All right, that is, yeah, that's, I think it was an interesting thing. But I think the width a person gets from practice in arts or some field like this can also benefit in some ways to the science, not in a direct way, but most importantly to the communication of science, which is also not as important as the result itself, but also highly relevant. And we will touch on this a bit later. However, I would also like to ask you, like, comparing to some of your first publications and now, how is the process of publicizing an article and finishing research? Do you think it's naturally different? But for you, is it easier? Is it more difficult? And in general, the situation with publishing companies, how do you feel the state of research right now?
I mean, you know, one obvious thing is the volume of data has increased exponentially. We can now, you know, we now spend more time analyzing our data than generating it, really. You know, and I guess when I started, you know, you would work all week on a Western blot or whatever, and when you submitted an article to a journal, you may only have had 4 or 5 panels of data in it. You know, now I was looking at this recently. One paper that we published last year or the year before in Cancer Research had, you know, something like 116 separate panels of data. So there's a clear change. I guess what happens philosophically there is you become more of a curator and an editor of the data than before. Before was a very simple, you know, I guess mechanistic understanding of, okay, is this protein changed in this tumor type in relation to whatever? You know, now it becomes more of a task of overseeing an incredible volume of data garnered by very different technologies and trying to integrate all of that into a coherent story. And I guess, you know, coming back to the writing thing, as a novelist, you know, you're integrating a lot of information and laying that information out for the reader, and having to have big oversight of any page, any chapter, any moment, what was actually happening. So yeah, to answer your question, I think it's a volume of data thing and a philosophical shift really to being more sort of editorial and you know, having oversight of the story than just the nuts and bolts of the story.
I understand. And tell me some of the key moments in your career that don't have to necessarily be the highlights with regards to getting this position or getting this education, but for you personally, what are the key moments of your career?
I think science is mainly failure. Okay, it's 99% failure. We know this, right? But most experiments fail, most grants get rejected, most papers get rejected, and it's a career of just having a thick skin and pushing on and failing and then failing better and coming back stronger. I think the only career highlights I would suggest are ones where we've had what I felt to be a really good paper accepted in a really good journal. And those things don't come along very often, particularly or when you've had a big grant funded, and you may have had 2 years of from the outside utter failure. And I think interestingly in science there are times when people look at you and think you're succeeding, but you feel internally you're failing. And there are times I think when people look at you and think you're failing, whereas you think internally actually I'm succeeding because I'm building something here. So failure and success is really interesting in science. It's not always what it seems to be from the outside. But I would just highlight, good papers that got accepted, good big grants that got funded. Those are the moments that you remember.
All right. And what was some of the biggest challenges or adversities that you faced? I mean, you touched on this now with the notion of failure in general, but sometimes there is some moments that kind of set you back in a stronger term, or even some thoughts or opportunities that are not within your lane or desires. So maybe we could touch on also this. What would be some of your biggest challenges?
I mean, I suppose in the UK, I'm a basic scientist, working in a fairly clinical translational research field, and I think that's a challenge every day. Funding is difficult. Getting funding for basic biomedical research is tough, and I think that's comes back to that issue of failure and relentless pursuit, and failing better each time. So that the challenge is a constant one, really, of keeping a laboratory group going. I've been lucky over the last 20 or 25 years to have a laboratory group of between 8 and 10 people most of the time. But keeping that show on the road, that's the challenge. It's the central challenge. It's what keeps you awake at night. It's what keeps you pushing on and coming back from those failures to build back stronger each time.
I understand, and it's pushing not only yourself but your team, and being a leader with ideas and constant leveling between the grants and the funding and this type of work, which is different than the actual scientific work per se, but cannot be disconnected for the leads of the research. And that's of course interesting.
I mean, it's an interesting disconnect that I guess while my group are in the laboratory just behind me, doing their experiments, I'm here writing the next set of experiments and hoping that they will be funded. And some great ideas will never be funded, and some terrible ideas do get funded. We mustn't overlook the contribution of luck to science and progress. Right time, right place. And I, having chaired national funding panels, I chaired the Wellcome Trust Basic Science Committee for a few years. You get to see behind the scenes that careers are made and destroyed on lots of luck when it comes into the the funding panel. And I think as a message to young and early career scientists, you have to understand that not all failure is merited, but you must take that failure on the chin and come back and say, okay, well, next time I'm not going to give them an excuse to bounce this grant. Next time it's going to be harder for them to say no.
Absolutely, and this was actually one of my next questions, was the messages that you have for the early career investigators, which is of course something that we've heard in a lot of other interviews, but is probably a central thing in research in general, is the perseverance and the notion that your idea is not connected to the reception of it, like within the granting system or within the grading paper system, because there the volume is very vast. And since you're also, and we're very thankful and happy that you're also working with us in the observership programs, being a mentor for the research observership, do you think that in general, the Early Career Committee, the EYES Committee, how do you feel about these activities that are going on there? And do you think that this benefits the early career branch of the European Society of Endocrinology in some way?
Yeah, I'm very happy the direction that the early career is going in, because I feel that you know, as you sort of highlighted, it's that outreach that's really important, and this observership program that's been running now for a little bit of time. You know, and I've been lucky to be involved with that. We had a terrifically keen and enthusiastic early career scientist come and join my lab for you know, a few weeks from Italy. It's those sort of things. Those are transformative in your early career. You know, you just said you've been to Paris for, you know, for you know, a kind of a period like this, and I think it's, you know, you learn so many lessons in that sort of situation, good and bad, and you know, sometimes the lessons you learn are lessons of, okay, I've seen how other people do it, I don't want to do it that way. It's not just that all experiences should be positive. Some of those experiences should be positive, and you go, okay, look, this group in Paris or Rome or whatever is doing this terrific stuff. We've got to do this. But you may go to other centres and say, well, I don't like the way they run that. When I go back to my centre, actually, from now on, we're going to make sure we don't do that sort of thing. So it just gives you something to react towards and away from. So I think what the early career committee is doing in terms of observership and other things, you know, are critical. And the other thing I would add, and I'm sure this is a commonality that other people have mentioned, but it's that platform for engagement of early career scientists, because it's very easy to work by yourself, laboratory in one country, in one city, you know, in one university. And until you come together with your colleagues who you don't even know exist, until you go to the conference and you meet 100 other early career scientists and clinicians, and you start to understand where you fit into everything, and that there are other people suffering like you're suffering, there are other people, you know, doing great things like you're doing great things. You know, it's that kind of platform that I think is the lifeblood of an organization like the European Society of Endocrinology.
Thank you for these words, and it is also a great news in a way that we have got the possibility to form also the advanced research observership programs, which will allow up to 3 months and with more funding. So I think, because of course naturally you can not do a proper experiment within 1 month. You barely have time to meet everybody at the lab. However, the 3 and more months, and I think there's a huge emphasis now on working more with the basic scientists and the translational scientists and getting this opportunity across to them, because for clinicians it's very different in a way, but it's necessary to connect more also in this field. Tell us, what are the scientists or non-scientific people in general in your life that inspire you the most? For everyday things and for scientific achievements and for also creative outings. Where do you draw your inspiration from?
Well, I suppose scientifically, firstly, I've come across people who, you know, who embody terrific principles of integrity, of you know, of vision, of achievement, and people like, you know, Paul Stewart, who was here at the University of Birmingham, Jane Franklin, who was my mentor, people like that. You know, Shlomo Melmed, who I worked for in UCLA in Los Angeles. You know, you come across these people and you think, actually, I want to be like part of you. You know, it would be rare to meet a mentor and think, I want to be you, because I think, you know, in science you have to develop your own independent characteristics, etc. But it's wonderful when you meet people who have some characteristics that you think, I really, really aspire to that part of that personality. I think away from science, I've always been inspired by great writers. great philosophers, people who write a novel, but really within that novel are telling you about human nature, or about the ways of the world, or letting you peer under the bonnet of something that you wouldn't normally peer under. And I know my earliest favorite writers were people like Mark Twain and George Orwell, and I guess in all walks of life. And I guess in the real world, for me, it's what doesn't impress me is money or anything like that. The only people I ever really am impressed by and look up to are people who've had more adventures than I've had. So anyone who has lived a more interesting life than me, has been more places, done more things, has tried more, experienced more, those are the people that really inspire me.
Fantastic. And apart from writing, which we've touched on, do you have any other interesting hobbies? We heard something also about sports activities, but in general, how do you divide your time and how do you plan to engage in activities that fulfill you in a way and bring more towards your scientific work? So what are some of your lanes of work apart from writing and research?
Well, I'm mildly obsessive when it comes to exercise. So I used to be a very serious runner and football player. These days I do kickboxing, so martial arts. I enjoy a lot. Cycling, I've just been to the Tour de France and cycled some of the mountain climbs there. So for me, sport has been and exercise has been really critical to my life, because I think it's a cliche, but the mental side balancing the physical side. And for me, the physical side of my life is every bit as important as the intellectual side of my life. Without one without the other just would not work for me. So it's always been kind of maybe hurting your body physically to stoke up the pain of your mental efforts. I think it's a terrific way of balancing life.
Well, I think we get in general a lot of out of the process of not only mind control but the struggle with ourselves, and these long-term activities that are repetitive and that are in a way sort of a meditation. It is similar when studying and thinking about a scientific idea or studying for a long exam. It's also similar to these sports that that require endurance and require some sort of mental stability towards the physical. So I think, and also a lot of the people we've discussed with in general have a very serious, in a way, sport activities that they take seriously, because it reflects also the way that they function, not only in sports but also in life. So I think that's a very important point, and it's hopefully more people would find some space and time to participate in serious sporting events, because I think it's also very crucial for every aspect of daily life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the word that you really touched on there is endurance. And I think, that for me, running, cycling, whatever else I've done in my life, I think it's that, it's not just the dissipation of the mental energies that sometimes, build up. You get frustrated about something or anxious or whatever it is in your life that can be balanced by exercise. But I think it's that endurance, that kind of going out there for a long run or a long cycle ride or whatever else it is, that kind of if you have the sort of mental stamina to endure, then it's an obvious point to make, but in it's a career of endurance.
What is the future plans in a way, like what are your key goals for the short period ahead, and also what would be your messages for we touched on a lot of topics, of course, but for the early career investigators listening to us for the first time and meeting you through this interview, what would be your crucial message for them at the end?
Well, look, I mean, so my short-term goals really at the moment is achieving a large funding grant, to keep my research team going. I take over as the Chief Operating Officer of the American Thyroid Association soon, and that's a big job, and one goal is to really make a success of that and bring all I can to that. I think in terms of message to the early career scientists amongst you guys, I mean, I think it's in addition to what we've talked about in terms of thick skin, endurance. I think it's to always think slightly beyond the research question that you're actually answering. And the best postdocs and early career scientists I've worked with are not the ones who come and say, okay, what experiment are we doing today, boss, or anything like that. It's the ones who start to bit by bit look at their research question, be critical of it, understand its weaknesses, and start to think, actually, why don't we move it in this direction? And then you go to your PI, your supervisor, and you start to say, look, I've really been thinking about this. There may be a better way to go. So I think it's very easy as an early career scientist to be beholden to your supervisor or principal investigator or whatever. And that's great. But really, the best 10%, 20% are the ones that, understand the research question, where it's going, but understand slightly more about the research question and where it might go, not just where it is going, but where it could go. And that's the secret to science, of course, is to always be thinking ahead of the immediate problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah, and this in a way is what we could say is scientific freedom, is to play within the question that you've asked, and maybe even stray a lot of times towards a direction which is not correct, but learn how to play within the field. Because we usually, when there's a lack of knowledge, when somebody's starting out, you go very linear. You get a question, you read the papers, you try to just focus on the outcome and like a binary thing, like yes, no, and that's it. But the more experience you have, the more freedom you have within the field, and then you can actually contribute. So yeah, it's a very important thing, and I'm sure that a lot of early career investigators that would hear this would be inspired by your story, not only your fantastic achievements scientific wise, which we are all aware of, however, also the other aspects of your daily life and functioning, because I think these messages are very, very important. And it's great that the inspiring professors within our society are the people who are very diverse in their interests and in their backgrounds. So thank you for this interview. And we will definitely be seeing more of you within the collaborations with also the early career investigators in many ways. And thank you for all the work and support for our community. So
thank you so much.
So thank you.